Well, good morning and good afternoon. I feel very much honored to say a few words to introduce Professor Susan Hunston to the young scholars here. I say young scholars because many of the experienced corpus researchers in China already know Professor Susan Hunston quite well. And Professor Susan Hunston served as the president of the British Association of Applied Linguistics for many years. And he was a key corpus linguist in the past 2 decades. And all the corpus linguists in China know the monumental work of pattern grammar, which is written by Professor Susan Hunston in collaboration with Gil Francis. And also another important work is the Corpora in Applied Linguistics, both the first edition and the second edition. The corpus linguists in China enjoyed reading them quite well. And in the past few years, or I can say over the many years, Professor Susan Hunston helped the corpus linguistics in China in many ways. She came to China to give talks at Beihang University, Shanghai Jiao-tong University, and Beijing Foreign Studies University, among others. And all of us derived the important insights from her talk. And particularly, I'd like to mention Susan has trained many bright scholars for corpus linguistics in China, and Professor Su Han is one of them. I myself particularly enjoy hearing Susan's talk and reading her books. Whenever Susan came to China to give a talk, I always attend the talks from beginning to end. Let's welcome Professor Susan Hunston. Let's enjoy hearing her talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Wei. Thank you for that very kind introduction, and Professor Su Han and other friends and colleagues who are attending this talk who I can't see. It's a great honor to be here. I've always valued very much my connections with colleagues and universities in China, and it's a great privilege to be talking to you today and again tomorrow. So I'm going to be giving quite an introductory session on corpus linguistics methods. So my apologies to those of you for whom this will be rather familiar ground, but I hope for some of you it will be useful as well. So as we all know, corpus is a collection of texts, which is usually quite a large number of texts. It's usually said that a corpus has in it more texts than you could deal with just by reading them. They've been selected to represent some kind of language, which might be Australian English, or newspapers published in India, or the writing of students studying economics in China, or some group of people. The corpus represents that language, stored electronically and searched using specific software. And I think it's really the methodology, the way of searching that makes the corpus a corpus in a way. So I'm going to be talking about a few of the methods that are used in corpus linguistics. And we start with the most simple of all, which is counting words. And here is a really simple example. It's taken from the British National Corpus, just a general reference corpus from the 1990s. Appearance and disappearance. And what intrigues me about these words is the very different frequency that they have. Particularly in the phrase in appearance. So here, angular in appearance. Whereas disappearance has the first two meanings of those. So something goes out of existence, as in the example here, the disappearance of tropical rainforests, or it means you can't see it anymore. But there isn't this third meaning. And that seems to account for the difference in frequency. Now, if we look at another corpus, and this is one that I'll be talking about a little bit today. This is a journal about environmental issues, and it's called Global Environmental Change. And in that journal, if we look at the frequency of appearance and disappearance, it's still the case that appearance is more frequent than disappearance. The numbers are, of course, very much smaller because the corpus is very much smaller. So we've got 46 instances as opposed to 34 instances. But the difference between the two is a great deal less. And this, again, we can see by looking at the percentages. So it's much nearer to half-half, or it's 60% as opposed to 40%. And this would seem to tell us that the notion of species disappearing is much more important and talked about much more in global environmental change than it is in English in general. And so it points us towards one of the themes of that journal, which is the changes to the environment, obviously, because of the title of the journal. And one of the consequences of changes in environment is that species disappear. So the disappearance of species is one of the things that the journal talks about. Now, this illustrates three general principles that I'm going to come back to throughout the talk. That corpus work is quantitative. So we started here with numbers, and even when the statistics are really, really simple and not in any way difficult, the starting point is still quantitative. Secondly, the work is comparative. It pretty much always compares two or more things. So in this case, we compared appearance with disappearance, and we compared the British National Corpus with global environmental change. I must say that it kind of worries me that corpus linguistics is always comparative. And I do wish there was some way of moving away from that. But every time I try and move away from it, I come back to the fact that you're only making really important observations when you're comparing things. But also the work is qualitative, because the numbers by themselves don't actually tell us anything. They just say there's something interesting here that you might want to look at more in more detail. And the explanation is what I would regard as the important part of the work. I'm going to give another example now of just simply counting words and phrases. This is work from Leach et al. From back in 2009. And what they did was they looked at change in the grammar of English, but instead of looking at change from, say, the 17th century to the 20th century or something, they looked at a very short time span between 1961, shown in blue on the screen, and 1991, shown in orange. And I must say, I must stress that this is not a table that comes from Leach et al. What I've done here is to combine two tables. So their tables are much better because I've had to alter the scale here to combine the two tables. But what you see is that the relative frequency, if you look at the words will, can, may, must, and might, the relative frequency doesn't change between 1961 and 1991. So in both decades, will is most frequent and might is least frequent. But in most of these words, they have declined in frequency somewhat between 1961 and 1991. If you look on the other side of the screen, you see the phrases be able to, be going to, have to, and want to. And here, the tendency is the opposite way round. So with be going to and have to and want to, they have become more frequent in the 1990s than they were in the 1960s. And if you compare the single words and the phrases that kind of mean the same thing, like must to, like must and have to, must has decreased in frequency and have to has increased in frequency. And so in a sense, have to has come to replace parts of the uses of must. The exception to that, you will all be screaming at the screen, is can and be able to, because there the reverse is slightly true. So can, the frequency has remained more or less the same, increased very slightly. Be able to, the frequency is more or less the same, has decreased very slightly. So if we look at the principles again, things are counted, the work is quantitative, the work is comparative, one time is compared with another time, and indeed the single word modals are compared with the phrasal modals. But importantly, that by itself doesn't tell us very much. The work is also qualitative, and Leach et al. Go into this in a great deal more detail than I have today, because they explain the decrease in one item with increases in another item, and their book links this to what they call a decrease in the formality of English. So particularly written English between the 1960s and the 1990s tended to become a little bit more like speech, a little bit more like conversation, a bit more informal. So that's just about the most simple thing you can do with the corpus, is count things. Now going to look at concordance lines, and I always say...
excuse me, sorry to interrupt. I just got a number of people asking me if they can join the conference, and Charles said because you are the host, so if you can just let the participants in the meeting.
Waiting room, admit all. There we go.
Yes. Okay, very nice.
Is that all right? Is everybody in?
Okay, don't bother that. Just go ahead with the talk.
I think everybody's in now.
Yeah, that's fine. Sorry, you.
I've managed to become a mute.
Okay,
Is that okay? Yes, yes. So welcome everybody who's just joined. Apologies for the slight break there. So I'm now talking about concordance lines, which to me are the great fun of doing corpus linguistics, is looking at concordance lines. So what we do here, concordance lines show all the instances of a given word in its immediate context. And we use them to make observations about the patterning in language. And they can be used to derive...
Again, sorry. You just stopped sharing that screen. So you need to share that screen again. Yes.
Are we there? I've got more people in the waiting room as well.
So if you can let all of them in.
Yeah. There we go. Okay, now can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Sorry, I keep having more people joining the waiting room. This is going to be quite difficult. They'll have to wait a little while. So I'm going to give a couple of examples now of concordance lines, and I'm going to start with a single verb, and then I'm going to look at a phrase. So we're going to see different kinds of information coming from of the words I was looking at. I got 10,000 concordance lines. Remember sitting, and in red we have remember followed by a noun followed by ing, remember the thing happening. Here we have in purple remember followed by a WH word, remember how, remember what. We've got remember that in red, and remember to do something in green. And we have in red, remember somebody for something in the passive here, and remember something as something. So even in just 23 concordance lines, obviously I've picked them, we can see the very large way that concordance lines the very large way that the word remember is used in English. So we've got evidence for how words are used. The concordance lines are showing us this variety, and this corpus is a general one, and so it's giving us general information about English words and grammar. I'm going to look at another example, but before we do that, I'm just going to let a few more people in. That should all come up now. Hello, people who've just come in. Sorry to keep you waiting there. And there's a few more. There we go. Right. So my next slide is, okay, so my next slide is back to the journal Global Environmental Change. And one of the words that was very frequent in this corpus is the word scientific. And one of the interesting things about the journal is the way that different writers for this journal have, as it were, different attitudes towards the notion of science and what is scientific. Now here, as a way of getting into this, we look at the word scientific and the nouns that follow scientific. And here are some of the frequent ones.
Sorry, student, just say a word. 参会的各位老师、各位同学们，请静下音。王燕飞请静下音，谢谢。Okay, student, just go ahead.
Okay. So we can, if we look at these nouns that occur frequently with the adjective scientific, one of the things that we can do is to group them in terms of what they mean and what they're saying about scientific. So here in blue, I've got communities of scientists, groups of scientists. In red, I've got the things that scientists do. In green, notions of certainty and uncertainty. And in purple, scientists talking to others. And the phrase I'm going to look at is one that is one of the most frequent, and that is scientific knowledge. And an intriguing thing, as I say, about the journal is the way that science is looked at differently. In the first example here, the plan failed to draw adequately on existing scientific knowledge. It's criticizing the plan, but the notion of scientific knowledge is kind of taken for granted. Scientific knowledge must be right, and plans should draw on what is right, what is known, what is true, which is the scientific knowledge. In the second example, scientific knowledge itself is made a problem. We're told here ignorance is endemic to scientific knowledge. I'm not entirely sure what that means, to be honest, except it means that we cannot trust scientific knowledge in a way, that scientific knowledge is very partial. It doesn't tell us everything we need to know. And so it was different examples like that was the motivation for looking at concordance lines for the phrase scientific knowledge, which is what I then did, and found three groups of concordance lines. So in a lot of instances, scientific knowledge does not reflect the truth. Scientific knowledge is socially constructed. It is not a reflection of nature. So you can see a lot of examples here. Ideology of science, scientific knowledge is one factor, scientific knowledge is constructed, scientific knowledge is elevated above local knowledge, but it should not be. The ways scientific knowledge is generated, the ways scientific knowledge is made. It's all about the artificiality, if you like, of scientific knowledge. It's a kind of anti-science discourse that actually, personally speaking, I don't like, but it's very much there in this journal. There are rather fewer cases where scientific knowledge is used by other agencies and sometimes misused and sometimes misunderstood. And rather fewer lines again about scientific knowledge being correct but slow and only partial. So here, what we're looking at is not anything about English. It doesn't tell us about how the phrase scientific knowledge should be used. It doesn't tell us anything about grammar. It doesn't really tell us about lexis. But it tells us about the attitudes of the people who are writing in the corpus. And I'd suggest also that reading concordance lines is a skill, and it's something that requires practice to be able to observe patterns of use. But one of the things I would say is that working myself and working with other people, including students who have used concordance lines, one of the fascinating things is that everybody can see something different. And it's also a case, I think, that it's where being a native speaker of English doesn't particularly help you. And quite often some students who I've been working with, who've been from other countries, that other languages are their first languages, they've looked at a set of concordance lines and they've seen something that I haven't seen, because everybody is a novice when they come to look at a set of concordance lines. So I'm going to move on to talk about collocation, and I also need to let some people in. There we go. So, moving on. So collocation means that two words are closely associated, and we know this intuitively because we say something like dark night. We know that the words dark and night often go together. We also know that if we're going to define the word dark, we might say, well, it's what happens at night. And if we're going to define night, we might say it's when everything is dark. So the two words are very closely associated. And that's been known for a very, very long time. But with corpus work, what we can do is to measure the frequency with which these words co-occur. And we can say that they co-occur more often than would occur by chance. Usually when we measure collocation, we count words in a span, each side of the node word or the central word. And we often look at 4 words to the left and 4 words to the right, or what's known as plus or minus 4. And there are various statistical measures that are used. And if you're interested in this, you can read a whole load of stuff about the value of different methods. And it is important because the different statistical measures do tell you rather different things, as we shall see in a moment. But they're all looking at the strength and the certainty of the connection between two words. And in general, they compare what's observed, so in other words, how often the words occur together, with what is expected, how often they would occur together if the distribution was random. So here's an example just to show you what 4 words each side of the node looks like. So here we've got the word species, and it comes from a corpus made from a book called The Rough Guide to Evolution. And in bold here, so you've got species in concordance line, species in the middle of the screen, and 4 words either side. And what the measures do is they count up all those words and they say, how often does a single word like of or in or consist or Darwin or any of those words that you can see there, how often does that word occur within that span, within that plus or minus 4 words? And if we look at this, these are 3 ways of calculating collocation strength and collocation certainty. We've got log likelihood, we've got MI score, and we've got T-score. And all I want to show you here is that the log likelihood and the t-score give us not the same list, but very similar lists. And MI score gives us a very different list. This is because t-score and log likelihood both make the score higher if the combined two words are very frequent in the corpus, whereas then MI score gives a very high score if the strength of the collocation, if they mostly occur together, even if they don't occur together very often. And I think, so what you do with a set of concordance lines, with a set of collocates, is really look to see if you can see any general rules, general patterns that are occurring there. So one of the things I would look at in these collocations is to say, okay, I want to look at the word of. It's at the top of the list for log likelihood and t-score, and also because I like prepositions, and I always think that of is a interesting word to look at. I'd also look at those words in bold: new, separate, distinct, related, one, two, partly because they occur in all the lists, which is unusual, and also because they seem to have they don't mean the same thing, obviously, but they are to do with being separate, or they're to do with being not separate. So one of the things I would want to do next in concordance lines is to look at the phrase of species and to say what nouns come before of species, mutability of species, appearance of species, and what about the phrase species of moth, species of turtle. And then in all the lists, as I said, there are words connected with identifying species and distinguishing one or two species, and thereby finding new species. And of course, one of the themes of the book, because the book is about evolution, is about the effort that scientists put in to deciding when they had found a new species and what constituted different species. I'm just going to do my usual trick here and admit a few more people. And I think we've done that. And now turn to another example of collocation. This is a very well-known example, and it comes from a study of the UK press, so British newspapers. And this is an example taken from the book by Baker et al. They were looking at how you can use a newspaper corpus to find out about the representation of social groups. Part of their argument is that people are very influenced by what they read in newspapers. And so if we see how particular social groups are identified in newspapers, we see how attitudes are formed by those newspapers. And in particular, they're looking where there might be problems with attitudes towards certain people, and how these problems might be caused by representation in the press. So one of the words they were looking at was the word Muslim. So this is the British press here, and they looked at collocates of the phrase Muslim men and collocates of the phrase Muslim women. And what I've done here is, again, in order to get it on the slide, I've somewhat oversimplified what's in the book. The book is better than this. I have selected items here so that I could show it to you on a slide. I've again combined two tables. But you'll see that one of the first things they've done here is to group the collocates together. So they've and given them put them into a category that they've given a name to. So they've got a category here that they call identity, and they've got words in this for both the men and the women. And some of those words are the same. So you've got young and children in both. You've got wives, you've got husbands. Rather interestingly, in the Muslim men group, you've got the word dating, and in the Muslim women group, you've got the word marry. But anyway, but then you have some differences as well. So different categories. So in the Muslim men side of the table, there are the categories words to do with killing and words to do with radicalization. Now, remember, we don't know at this stage what is being said. We only know that there are a lot of words in this category, and we would need to look at the concordance lines to find out what was being said. In the Muslim women side of the table, we have the categories, the veil, and the category freedom, and the category oppression. So all we know, in a sense, here is that the Muslim men are talked about differently from the way that Muslim women are talked about. And what they then do, of course, is to take some of these themes and examine them in more detail, rather interestingly. So they've grouped the collocates according to meaning. And going back to our themes, this is a qualitative interpretation of quantitative information. So the collocates are derived from a quantitative study, but you've immediately got a qualitative human interpretation of that quantitative information. We're looking at the representation of men and women, showing they're partly the same and partly different, and also, of course, showing how Muslim men and Muslim women in the newspapers that they looked at tend to be stereotyped. And it suggests where the stereotypes come from the representation in the newspapers. And we've seen the different categories in the two columns. Turning to a rather different example, this is an example from English for Academic Purposes, a paper by Lay and Liu, where they went a step further and looked at word class pairs. So a little bit as I was doing with the adjective, noun, scientific, and the nouns that followed the word scientific. But in this case, taking any adjective and any noun and what are the collocates of that pairing. And so there's an example of their frequent collocates were careful analysis or necessary skill. Verb and noun, they've got apply method and conduct analysis. They looked at adverb plus verb, and they have directly apply and tentatively suggest. Adverb and adjective, significantly different and widely available. And noun plus verb, the analysis suggests, the results indicate. And the idea here is that it's a more useful tool than a simple academic word list for deriving things that need to be taught to people who are learning English for academic purposes. It gives you these phrases and collocations that are most useful to use. Just so you can... Other people have done a very similar thing. Green and Lambert, in a fairly recent paper, have done this, looking at different disciplines. so they're able to be more specific. And I've just given you some examples here. For each of these disciplines, they look at noun, noun, adjective, noun, noun, verb, and verb, noun. But I've obviously made a selection here for each of the disciplines. So illustrating this for biology, you've got noun, noun phrases like carbon dioxide, amino acids, water potential, blood cells, and so on. For mathematics, I've given you some examples of adjective, noun, standard deviation, significant figures, and so on. For economics, I've given you some subject-verb combinations, quantity supplied, curve shifts, services produced. And remember that in all of these cases, these are not words that necessarily occur directly next to each other. They are words that occur significantly frequently within that span, probably plus or minus 4. I can't actually remember what span Green and Lambert used, but it's something like that. And then with history, we've got verbs and objects: took place, declared war, invade Cuba, took control, and so on. So the discipline-specific words there. So we're now moving on to the final topic that I deal with in any detail, and this is the notion of keywords. The notion of keywords comes from Mike Scott's work, where he asked, if you have a corpus, what words are special? If you take a corpus and you look at the most frequent words in the corpus, they're always going to be the, of, in, at. They're going to be the grammatical words. And even if you have a word like say or person, or type or way, you don't know whether those words are frequent in this corpus because they're always frequent in every corpus, or because these words are particularly special to this corpus. So he was asking if you compare two corpora, which words are significantly more frequent in corpus A than in corpus B? And this tells us which words in corpus A we should look at more closely, because these are the special words for this corpus. And it also tells us what corpus A is about. And again, I'm going to illustrate this with words from particular disciplines. And this is again from Green and Lambert, but a slightly earlier paper. So before they did the work on collocation, they did the words on academic keywords, and they were looking at what makes disciplinary language special compared with academic language in general. So they took 8 disciplines. We've seen 4 of those disciplines before, and they got a corpus for each discipline. And they compared each discipline corpus with the corpus of all the others. So they weren't asking how special is academic language. They were saying, if you take all academic language, how special, what makes the language of economics special? And you can see that what they were saying was, if you've got learners who have learnt general English, and they've learnt a kind of general academic English, which might have told them the sorts of things that Lei and Liu were coming up with. So the words that are very useful in any kind of academic English. What do they then need to learn to be able to operate in their own very specific discipline? And they had certain criteria to include words in their list. And one of the criteria, the last that I put at the bottom of the slide here, is that the word must be key. So in other words, they defined this, it must occur at least 3 times more frequently in the discipline corpus than in the reference corpus. But they also said it must be a noun, a verb, an adjective, or an adverb. and it must be frequent. And they had an extra criterion, which is that it must occur throughout the corpus, not just in a few texts. This notion of words occurring distributed throughout the corpus is something that's becoming something that people talk about a lot more. A recent publication by Biber, Egbert and Larsson talks about this a great deal and says there's no point having a word which appears to be very frequent in the corpus if it only occurs in one or two papers. And this does remind me that when I was talking about scientific knowledge, and I talked about the kind of anti-science discourse, which said that scientific knowledge cannot be trusted. In fact, when you look at the concordance lines for that, you find that it's not distributed throughout the whole corpus. It's only a few papers that talk about this, but talk about it a lot. So, coming back to Green and Lambert and their work on this. So their academic keywords are basically these. So they've got biology, chemistry, economics, geography, maths, history, English, and physics. And what you should find if you look in those lists, you should be saying, oh yes, these are words which it's important to know if you're going to study physics or history or economics or whatever. And they are words that you probably don't need to know if you're not studying physics or maths or economics or whatever it is. And in fact, in order to test this methodology, what they do is to say, are we certain that these words occur very much more often in our discipline corpus than they do in any of the other corpora? And if so, then we've got a really good word list for the teaching of economics or biology or English. Actually, the English list, I don't know how it appears to you, but it strikes me as actually the least successful of those lists. And I think it's probably because English as a subject is much less defined than is history or even geography or certainly chemistry or biology. But that takes us into other directions, I think. So coming back to the principles that we are talking about, again, the emphasis is on quantity. Behind everything that I've been talking about today is how often does this word or phrase occur? How often is this said? This how often just occurs over and over again. But that quantity is assessed through comparison. Is this said significantly more in this corpus than in that one? Do these words co-occur more frequently than you would expect? Always the comparison. And then the most important thing, the quantity then has to be interpreted. The statistics have to be right, but in the end, all they give you is lists of words, lists of phrases, lists of things to look at. What does it mean that the words are frequent or the collocations are strong? And in every case where I've shown you examples of the work, what people have done after the work that I've shown you is to go on and look at the concordance lines, which are the places where you find out what is said and therefore why it is that these words or these phrases are frequent or why these collocations are strong. Now, I'm just going to mention a couple of things that things I haven't talked about, and I'm not going to talk about these in any detail, but I will be talking about them, some of them, in the talk tomorrow, which goes much more into the various applications of corpus linguistics. but other commonly used methods, as it were, multidimensional analysis by Biber and others, and also from Biber, the notion of lexical bundles, which is a bit like simply word frequency, except it's series of words frequency. So 3 words coming together, or 4 words coming together, 3 grams or 4 grams, and treating those as a single item. An aspect which, again, I haven't talked about, but which a lot of people use, is the notion of semantic tagging. Much of the work I've talked about has depended on part of speech tagging. So if you're going to look for adverb and adjective, for example, you have to know what is an adjective and what is an adverb and what is an adjective. And the corpus has to be pre-tagged so that it's identified all the adverbs and all the adjectives. So that's lain behind a lot of what we've been talking about today. But Paul Rayson at Lancaster University has gone beyond that and tagged a corpus for semantic classes. And so they have a very large database, essentially a dictionary, with every word categorized into a semantic set. And you can then apply that to any corpus and say what are the most frequent semantic sets within a particular corpus. One of the ways in which corpus linguistics is changing, I think, is that it's adopting more methods from natural language processing, which is much more computational than most corpus linguistics is. And one of the most interesting applications of that, I think, is sentiment analysis by people, for example, Bing Liu, who does sentiment analysis, where words are classified according to their affectual meaning. And so the words like perfect and good and wonderful are classed positively, and awful, dreadful, terrible are classed negatively. And of course, it's much more complicated than that, the way they do it. But they can then measure the positive or negative affect in the corpus. If you're like me, you don't want to do that kind of work because it doesn't take you to concordance lines. And to me, the interesting thing is looking at concordance lines. So I like other people to do sentiment analysis, and sometimes it leads to things that I would like to look at in more detail. But to me, it takes you rather beyond the scope of corpus linguistics as such. So that is the conclusion of my talk. I've got the references there. I'm going to stop sharing the screen so that I can see people. And Suhan, can I make you host?
You don't need to, because I don't need to share the screen. We may just have some time for discussion or for any questions. But before that, I'll just say a few words. Thank you very much, Susan, for the wonderful talk about some basics in corpus linguistics and its applications in linguistic research. You have talked about the keywords, how to read concordances, comparing collocates, and then generalized the kind of basic principle that is quantitative, qualitative, and comparative of corpus linguistic research. Also, some case studies were presented to illustrate how this can be applied in practice. And I believe all of us have benefited a lot from the talk. And as we still have some time, I'm just wondering, would anybody have any questions? We may have some time for discussion and for Susan to answer your questions. I think this is a good chance if you have any. So, Charles? Well, if there's no questions, we'll talk. Well, anyway, so if we don't have any questions, I'm just going to say, okay, we have one in the.
We've got a question in the chat, which is the accuracy of semantic tagging. Oh dear, how long have you got? I think I think in a sense that's an unanswerable question because it depends what you mean by accuracy. I also think it depends. So semantic tagging, as I said, it's based on essentially getting a dictionary of words which are given a score based on their affectual meaning. So one of the questions is, how do you know what the affectual score should be? And that is sometimes done by asking people. So you do things like one of those general surveys that people can do, and you say to thousands of people, tell us how positive you think this word is. So if you have a word like centipede, do you think that's a positive word or a negative word? And you do this, so that's one way of doing it. So you get people's impressions of a word, or people use other methods such as how close to a word like good does this word generally appear? Is it a colloquy of good? So it's all dependent on these sort of indirect measures of how positive or negative a word is, and then it depends on counting. Now, I should say that I don't think it's very accurate because the assumptions underpinning it are so vague. So to me, if you ask a load of people, do you think this word is positive or negative, you shouldn't really get a very good answer. On the other hand, I have to say that the examples of sentiment analysis that I've seen do work. And I think they work because they're spread on such a large amount of data that all the little inaccuracies get ironed out. And it does actually seem to work. And so rather reluctantly, I confess, rather reluctantly, I have to say, I think sentiment analysis is rather accurate. And proof of that, in a way, is that a lot of companies, a lot of commercial enterprises pay money to have it done for them because it allows them to see what people think of their products. And they wouldn't spend the money if it didn't work. I've got a lot of other questions, I think. Do you want to pick one out, Suhan?
I just found one quite interesting. So I think the participants asked, sorry, I got another one. So could you share your most recent research or thoughts regarding corpus approach to evaluation? That's one of your specialties. So on evaluation, corpus approach to evaluation.
Yes. I guess one thing I point to is actually work done with Professor Suhan, which would be on attempting to generate local grammars of evaluation, to join together things that come from appraisal theory and from corpus linguistics, and particularly pattern grammar, which actually, if taken a long way, would go a little bit towards meeting sentiment analysis in the sense that it would kind of automate the identification of certain kinds of evaluative meaning. But I refer you to Professor Suhan on that, I think, because he did most of the work on that.
Thank you, Susan.
Read his papers.
That's my own, Susan. There are a lot of other questions. Another one is by Huangxiang, it's a beginner. I'm saying now the scope is kind of trend and the pressure. So the question is, so it's the kind of trend in nowadays is that the corpus, or if there's a kind of pressure for researcher to use corpus. So how do you think? What do you think about this kind of trend? Well, I think
this is the corpus becoming a trend. Yes. I think you're right. And I think corpus linguistics has become very mainstream. When I started doing it, hardly anybody did it, and people talked about it as a very new fashion that might immediately disappear, and it didn't disappear. It became mainstream. I think, obviously, I think corpus linguistics is a useful thing to do, but I think what I've shown is perhaps that some of the eyes and hands are the things that will inspire the corpus study. So sorry to give the same example again, but that example of scientific knowledge, why did I bother to look at that phrase? Because in reading the articles in our corpus, reading some of them, I thought, gosh, some of these people are really against scientific knowledge. They're really against science. And they're writing in a scientific journal, and they're against science. And to be honest, I didn't get that from the start from a corpus study. I could probably pretend I did. I could probably write about it as if I did. But actually the motive for it came from just reading the articles. And my own PhD study, which is, before any of you were born, was just based on eye and hand. And in fact, I am too embarrassed to tell you how small a number of texts I looked at, because it was very, 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 very small indeed. And although that work I've later embellished with corpus searches, and I think improved it because of corpus searches, it started from eye and hand. And so I would say, if the eye and hand leads you to a point where you think doing this on a bigger scale would be useful, then you need corpus linguistics, but it doesn't have to start there.
Okay. I think there's another one question raised by I guess it's Kathy Ning. Not sure if you still remember her from Shanghai Jiao-Tong University. So she asked me the question. So if we compare pattern grammar, local grammar, and the Valence grammar, so what do you think about the relationship or the commonality or differences between them?
I think, thank you for your question, Kathy. Nice to see you again. I've been thinking about this a lot lately because I'm working on a project at the moment which is trying to bring some of these things together, which is driving me mad. Because what has happened clearly is that there is something about language which is vaguely to do with patterning and meaning. And many, many people have, in a sense, made the same observations because it's there, and have tried to account for it in different ways. And a lot of people are, in a sense, saying very similar things using different language. Unfortunately, of course, they're not saying exactly the same thing, because if they were, you could just translate one term into another. They're doing things slightly different. But I think they are all very valid and very good attempts to account for a single observation, which is the importance of lexis and meaning and grammar being, in a sense, all one phenomenon. I don't know if you can see the whiteboard behind me, but it's I'm getting all tied up with looking at a pattern and looking at trying to see it as a system network and trying to bring in terms from FrameNet and bringing in terms from systemic functional grammar, valency grammar, local grammar. The terminology could drive you mad. And I think in the end, you have to pick one and stick with it, simply because you can't actually bring them all together. You just have to admit that they are different ways of seeing the same thing.
Okay.
But thank you for your question. It's a good one.
So we have another question. I think it's quite simple, but I guess it might be useful for some of the participants. So it's kind of like for some kind of newcomers to the field of corpus linguistics. Do you have any suggestions or advice? So it's quite simple. It's just like they wanted some suggestions from the expert. So how can they start some research in the field of corpus linguistics, or how to get familiar with corpus linguistic research?
Well, there are courses. Lancaster University, University of Birmingham, I'm sure other universities in China run short courses on corpus linguistics. There are a number of introductory books. They all tend to be called, tend to have the same titles: Corpus Linguistics, Applications of Corpus Linguistics, Corpora in Applied Linguistics. Of course, I'd recommend my own book. Who wouldn't? I think one of the things is some of the software that's used now to do pretty simple things like the things I've been talking about today is pretty easy to use. So things like Sketch Engine or AntConc, some of them are free, and they have good website advice, things telling you how to use it, and they are written in a very accessible way. I am myself completely useless at computational stuff, but even I can understand them and use them. So I think trying it out is a good thing, because you can get a corpus from anywhere. You can make a corpus of anything you yourself have written. So if you've written essays for a course, you can make a corpus of your essays and find out which words you use most often.
Shall we just take one question or a few more questions? Do you have anything else how about your time? So we could call it the end of the talk, or we could take a few more questions.
I'm okay for...
No, well, in that case, I'm just going to pick one or two questions, and then we shall end the talk. Is that okay, Susan?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Asked, what do you think about the multilingual corpus? So the kind of corpus designed for varieties of the English. So it's kind of like the international corpus of English, I guess.
Yeah.
Or where the English is.
The International Corpus of English, I think, is a unique and very valuable resource. For those of you who know it, who don't know it, it's a project which is designed to collect each kind of communication should be in the corpus. So the corpora are very comparable with each other. So they have this amount of newspaper data and this amount of fiction and this amount of business communication or whatever. And so they they do something that other corpora, they allow you to do things that other corpora don't allow you to do. There are, of course, limitations. The fact that they're relatively small in corpus size, which is a bit of a limitation, and the fact that they're so carefully designed means that there's not much allowance for what might be internal variation within a country. And so, for example, you don't get things like bilingual code mixing that you might more reflect the reality of English in a particular place. But you should never not do something just because it can't be perfect, I think. And the International Corpus of English is a hugely valuable resource. And even if people then move on from that to do something else, it still doesn't detract from its value.
Okay, thank you, Susan. Okay, the final one. I guess the question was raised by one of my colleagues, Professor Wu. She wanted to know your meaning about your opinion about meaning in corpus linguistics. So it's quite a general question. So what does meaning mean in corpus linguistics?
Well, what does meaning mean is a very good question altogether, isn't it? But it's a very good question, because I guess what we do when we look at corpus linguistics is we are always looking for meaning, and we're always looking for what meanings are made in this corpus and how are they made. And I guess when we take a corpus linguistics approach to that, we're always looking at meaning as being a verbal thing, or a discourse thing, as my colleague Wolfgang Teubert would say. This is meaning as it is defined within a corpus. So it's entirely hermeneutic within the language. So we're not looking at meaning as it applies outside the corpus. So we're not looking at the relation, not looking so much at the relation between the word and the outside world. We're looking at meaning within discourse, of meaning being created within discourse. And I think the work, for example, the work that I quoted by Baker and colleagues on the representation of Muslims in the British press was not about, it was not asking what are Muslim people like. It was asking how are Muslim people represented and how different that may be from what people are like. So the meaning is entirely within the corpus. So that's not a good answer to your question, but it's the best I can do in a few minutes.
Well, thank you, Susan. I'm sorry we can't take all the questions raised by the participants. So if we haven't answered your question, I guess you may just email your question to me, to Susan, or even to Professor Wei Laixin. I'm saying this on Wei Laixin's behalf. So I'm also saying this on Susan's behalf. So if you could just email your questions to any one of us, we'll try our best to answer your questions. Because of the time, we can't take all of them. My apologies. This is not students' fault; it's my fault. Well, I also want to say the two talks were kind of filtered by the University of Malaysia and the Sichuan International Studies University. So for tomorrow's talk, Dr. Chow Mo-Huat from University of Malaysia will be sharing the students' talk. I hope that's fine for Susan. I'm sure that this should be fine. And I was just wondering, Chow, are you still there? And do you have any words to say?
No, it was brilliant. I look forward to tomorrow's session. I'm sure most of us, or if not all of us, yes, I'm looking forward to that as well. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. And Yan Li, Professor Zhou, do you have anything?
No, just thank you, and I'll see you tomorrow, Susan. Thanks for the talk.
Well, in that case, then, Susan, I would like to say thank you again, and I'm just saying this not only just before. Oh, okay. Professor Wei is also online.
Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you for your insightful talk. As I said at the very beginning, I always enjoy listening to you and hope to see you tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much, Professor Wei, and for his kind of introduction. Because that's actually my job, and Professor Wei just helped me to do the job. Thank you very much. Because Professor Wei and Professor Susan Hunston was kind of my two supervisors in my career. So I would also like to take this chance to thank them again for Susan to supervise my PhD, and I want to say doing a PhD under your supervision is one of the best things that ever happened to me so far. So really thank you again. And for Professor Wei, because I did my postdoc with Professor Wei, and he guided me a lot and also supported me all the time. Also thanks to Professor Wei. So if we don't have, and I guess because we are almost running out of time, and just asking Dr. Chao, and he didn't have anything else to say, so we'll just call it the end of the talk. Okay, see you tomorrow, Susan. And see you tomorrow, Professor Wei.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Tomorrow.
And thank you,
Bye.
thank you, everyone.
Bye, Susan.
And my apologies for not taking all the questions. So if you, as I said, if you want to know the answers, you just email your questions to me, to Susan, to Professor Wei, to anybody else. So we'll try our best to answer your questions. Again, thank you, Susan. See you tomorrow. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye all.